Good morning. How's everybody doing? Everyone enjoying the conference? I know we're standing in. We're blocking your lunchtime, so bear with us. But with something, in addition to the panel discussion, to have something else to look forward to, which is our lunch. My name is Armin Babajanian. I'm the CEO of the World Affairs Council of San Antonio. And welcome. We appreciate all of you for being here. This session is titled Continental Drift, the Transatlantic Relationship. This topic connects directly to our conference theme, which is the world on balance, yes, as we examine how shifting geopolitical priorities, emerging security challenges, and evolving public attitudes are reshaping partnerships between Europe and the United States. I'd like to note that our panelist, Thomas Wright, will be signing this book here right outside when we are done after the session in the foyer. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our wonderful moderator, Amy McKinnon of the Financial Times. Amy's reporting and analysis on global affairs makes her a terrific guide for this timely discussion. Please join me in welcoming Amy McKinnon and our distinguished panelists.
Testing. There we go. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. My name's Amy McKinnon. I cover the U.S. Europe relationship for the Financial Times. So when I was asked to moderate this session, and particularly with Tom and Liana, who are, I couldn't think of two better people to have here today to discuss this. So I couldn't say yes fast enough. We've got a lot to dive into. So the title of our panel today is Continental Drift, the Transatlantic Relationship. And when I was speaking to Matthew Hughes from the World Affairs Councils, he was joking that you could kind of conceivably have a panel called Continental Drift at any point in the past 20 years to discuss the U.S.-Europe relationship. But this year, it does feel we are in a distinctly different moment when it comes to the relationship between Washington and Europe. We've seen a huge amount of change, a good bit of turmoil, and a real kind of adjustment over the past 10 months since Trump returned to the White House in January. So I'm excited to dive into this today. Joining me, we have Liana Fix, who is a senior fellow for Europe at the Council on Foreign Relations, where she focuses on German and European foreign and security policy, transatlantic relations, and Europe's relations with Russia and China. And we also have Tom Wright, is a senior fellow with the Strobe Talbot Center for Security, Strategy and Technology at the Brookings Institution. He most recently served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Strategic Planning at the National Security Council in the Biden administration. So welcome. And I'm going to start, as a journalist, I will indulge myself with some questions on the news of the past kind of 36 hours about this 28-point peace plan for Ukraine. The war in Ukraine has obviously been a center point of the U.S.-Europe relationship since Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. It's something that I know Tom worked on a lot when you were in the White House in the Biden administration. And Trump has obviously reinvigorated and restarted efforts to bring this war to an end. So Tuesday night, Axios reports that there's a 28-point peace plan, which none of us had really heard of, was in the works. The Ukrainians tell us that this was the first they'd heard of it, and that the details in the plan are really kind of Russian maximalist demands, including halving of the size of Ukraine's military. What do you think is going on here? Liana, I'll start with you. I know you follow this war very, very closely.
Yeah, thanks so much, Amy. And it's great to be here. It's great to be here with representatives from the different councils. I already had the pleasure to travel to some of the councils, to speak at some of the councils, including in Naples in Florida, which was a wonderful opportunity. So it's great to have you all here in DC and to be able to speak to you. some quick first thoughts on the recent developments on the negotiation side. And then I'll try to draw some broader conclusion what that means for the dynamic in the transatlantic relationship that we see there. So on the positive side, we do see that the Trump administration and the president himself want to bring this war to an end. We can discuss the purpose of that, if it's for the Nobel Peace Prize, for bringing really peace to the world. But there is a continuous momentum, there is a continuous attempt to try again and again, despite past failures. And those past failures were mostly, the reason for those past failures was mostly that the Russian side really doesn't want to agree to a ceasefire, right? I mean, they, especially the Russian president, thinks he can accomplish more in Ukraine, and a ceasefire would be to his disadvantage, which doesn't mean that that they would not pretend to be interested in negotiations with the U.S. side, especially at moments in time when the pressure from the U.S. side on the Russians is increasing. So concretely on the 28 points plan, I think it's still unclear to what extent the administration really stands behind it, because it is such a maximalist Russian plan. I think if Vladimir Putin ever dreamt at night about how a plan might look like on his terms to bring the war to an end, that might be pretty much it. He might have some extra points to add. But I do think what we see right now in sort of the news and the panic about this plan, everyone trying to figure out what it means, is a dynamic that by now has been firmly established in the transatlantic relationship, which is the United States going forward, negotiating with the Russians, trying to negotiate with the Ukrainians, and the Europeans basically being on the other side and trying to correct the direction of U.S. policy there. And this kind of, I think from the European side, you can call it this kind of short-term crisis management, is something that we have seen as one of the most significant, I think, characteristics that have emerged in the transatlantic relationship since Donald Trump came into office. It is a policy of disruption, especially at the beginning, and Europeans trying to do damage control, trying to do short-term crisis management, both when it comes to Ukraine, but also when it comes to their own security, to the question how many US troops will be withdrawn from Europe, and so on. So we don't really, at this point, at least Tom might have a better view. I don't have a clear vision yet where the transatlantic relationship will be in, let's say, 2 or 3 or 4 years from now. And there's also not so much thinking in principle taking place about how it is changing, because everyone is so occupied with this short-term crisis management. I think we see some characteristics. It's definitely not a value-based relationship anymore to the extent that it was before. It is much more, the idea of alliances as something inherently positive does not exist anymore in this relationship. It's much more patron-client relationship, which tries to get the most out of that relationship instead of to invest into the future. The security guarantees from the US side for Europe seem to be much more conditional than they were in the past. So those are some first characteristics, but how that will look like in 3 to 4 years, I think is still playing out right now.
Thank you, Liana. I think you've really set the scene for us there on, where things stand in the Ukraine negotiations, but also what it means for the U.S. relationship with Europe. Tom, I mean, staying on this question of this peace plan, do you see a strategy here do you see it that the administration is pursuing when it comes to these peace talks? Can you see a through line? Because it kind of seems to wax and wane, at least viewing it from the outside, month to month. I mean, last month, the administration posed these very, very punishing sanctions on Russian energy companies, which was the first time they've done that in this administration. And it seemed like they were kind of moving to turn the screws on Russia. But now, less than a month later, you have this 28-point peace plan, which, as Liana said, is the stuff of Putin's dreams potentially if it were to be carried out. I mean, what do you think is the strategy here? Is there one?
Yeah, thank you, Amy, and it's great to be with you all today. And I used to, I think, be a regular speaker at your events and at this event, but also around the country a little bit. And then after I went into the administration, I haven't done this in a few years, so it's nice to be back. So, just taking a step back a little bit, I think when the Trump administration, when Trump won the election last November, they had an idea that basically if they froze the line of contact, the battlefield lines in Ukraine, and said Ukraine can't join NATO, they could bring the war to an end, right? And when we met with them, when our people met with them in the transition, that's basically, what Waltz said, right? It is what he said, Mike Waltz at the time. And, I thought that was wrong, but I didn't think it was absolutely sort of a crazy idea, right? Because you could say, well, look, Ukraine has not been able to take back territory. This war could go on for a decade. It's better to skip to the end, just recognize reality. They're not going to join NATO anyway, or, Trump doesn't want them to join NATO. So let's just do a bit of an ugly deal and sort of end it. And what we said to them was that our view was that wouldn't work, even if, one thought it was a good idea, because Putin's goals have pretty consistently been much more maximalist. What we described it as, he wants a neutered Ukraine, not just a neutral Ukraine, right? He wants to subjugate Ukraine because he's created a militarized enemy on his border through his invasion, and he has no answer to that except to sort of break Ukraine. And he was likely to insist on that. And Trump came in, he tried his plan. They put massive pressure on the Ukrainians, as we saw in the Oval Office meeting. I think they saw Zelensky as the problem. And, Ukraine can be difficult in these, talks, no question about it. We always thought they weren't the main problem, but, they were sort of insisting on certain security guarantees before agreeing to a ceasefire and all of that. And they basically did lean on Ukraine enough that Ukraine changed its position. So, the only change in the position of either party in this past year has been by Ukraine, which has basically embraced an immediate cessation to the war in March after the Oval meeting on February 28th. So, the Trump administration sort of figured out, I think, by April or May, that Putin was the main obstacle, that he would not agree. They proposed a plan that was heavily tilted toward Russia. It included the aspects I mentioned a moment ago, and a full lifting of sanctions, and an end to U.S. security assistance to Ukraine, and all of that. And Russia still said no. And in the Istanbul talks in the summer, they presented a memo that reiterated what their policy has been throughout. Now, there's been lots of back and forth and lots of false, lots of cul-de-sacs that have been run down, including at Alaska, where I think the Trump administration sort of misunderstood what the Russians were saying to them about security guarantees. But if you strip all of that away, the fundamental issue has been that the president has not really known what to do after realizing that Russia's the main problem, right? Because he doesn't want to hunker down for a long conflict. He doesn't really want to massively increase pressure, on the Russians. So they prevaricated quite a lot. And I would say, Amy, you're totally right. In the last couple of months, they've finally sort of moved toward a policy of, putting a little bit more pressure on Russia. And they've done that in a couple of ways. I think the most important is they agreed to sell weapons to Europe that will be transferred to Ukraine. And so they're not providing weapons through assistance like we did, but they are selling some weapons. Maybe not enough, but I think it meets a certain threshold of what's necessary, right? So I think that's one part. And then they're sort of gradually increasing some of the sanctions. They're not enforcing some of the others, which is a problem, but they're moving generally in the right direction compared to where they were. And so what all of that means is basically they have been accepting the war's not going to end anytime soon. I saw a European foreign minister recently, but I think he said this publicly actually, Radek Sikorski, who had said publicly he expects the war to go on for 10 years, right? Now, hopefully it won't go on that long, but the administration, I think, has been moving toward, okay, it's not going to end anytime soon, so support Ukraine. prevent Russia from making any meaningful gains in the battlefield, increase pressure on Russia so it will continue to pay a high price. And the Russian casualty numbers daily are about 1,500, right? And their casualty numbers in the war to date are between 950,000 and 1.25 million on the Russian side, and about 500,000 of them are believed to be killed in action, right? So that's just enormous numbers. So they are paying quite a high price. So that sort of is where we were about 4 days ago. And then 3 days ago, we had this story break, which was actually, they're looking at a deal that basically embraces all of the Russian positions as Amy described it, massive military demilitarization of Ukraine. Ukraine has to give up territory that it currently controls inside its own country. My impression from calling around a little bit, we've all been doing this the last 48 hours, is that this is more of a Witkoff thing with maybe Trump's blessing without his full buy-in, that Rubio didn't really know about it. It's a crazy plan. I mean, just to speak in plain English, like the idea that one side, the victim that hasn't been beaten in the war, ought to unilaterally demilitarize and the other side does not, I think would strike most reasonable people as completely wrong. And then the idea that Ukraine would have to give up, critical territory and fortifications that Russia's been unable to take in the last sort of almost 4 years of the war would also strike people as completely wrong. And so, to me, this is it's not about sort of complex sort of treaty issues or anything. If you just sort of explain to people what this entails, I don't think there will be much support for it in the United States, let alone in Europe or in Ukraine. I don't think it will survive. Like, I think Trump has gone back and forth, on this. But I think the biggest problem is that he needs to overcome his impatience for a deal and think not about ending the war soon. He should be thinking about, how do I create the conditions now to end the war in my term, right? And I think maybe he could get a deal in 2027, if Putin worries that a pro-NATO person is going to come back in 2028. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it might end in 2026, but I think he should be thinking ending it at all in his 4 years will be an accomplishment, right? And he should try to do the hard work now to create those conditions, because there's no chance of a reasonable deal to end this in the short term.
Thank you both for that. I want to kind of step back now. This time last year, I was kind of thinking about where we were in the U.S.-Europe relationship, and Trump had just been reelected. We were in the transition period, and I and a lot of other journalists were kind of looking at, okay, what does the second Trump administration mean for the areas we cover? And we do this with every change of administration. What's their policy going to be? How are these relationships going to evolve? And when I was talking to European officials at the time, and Liana, I'm curious your thoughts on this as well, because I know you're in touch with a lot of people in Europe. The mood was generally one of, okay, we've been here before. It was disruptive. The relationship was tense during the first administration. But the phrase I heard over and over again was, we know what we're dealing with now. The Europeans really felt like they had figured out Trump and figured out how to kind of handle him and navigate that relationship. How has that played out over the course of the 10 months, since the inauguration and the rubber has hit the road? Has it been, how the Europeans may have expected?
Yeah, I think, to be very honest, that was an attempt by Europeans to kind of soothe themselves and to calm themselves down, because they did not expect the outcome of this election. From their perspective, the Biden presidency meant that America was back, that the transatlantic relationship would be back to where it was since Cold War times. And when Trump got elected, I think it's also a fundamental misreading also of U.S. domestic politics on the side of the Europeans. But when Trump was elected, there was a lot of focus on, let's reassure ourselves that this is not the disruptive break in the relationship that many doomsayers predicted it would be. I think there was a rude awakening for Europeans, especially after the inauguration. So there were basically 2 to 3 events that really shook Europeans. The first was the meeting that Tom already alluded to between President Trump and Zelensky in the Oval Office. That, I think it's really difficult to underestimate the shock waves that went out from this meeting, not only because it was about Ukraine and Zelensky, but because many Europeans saw themselves in that chair, right? And thought, okay, if that's how Zelensky can be treated and Ukraine can be treated, what prevents that we as NATO allies could sit in the same chair at some point and be berated for not being thankful enough that the United States comes to our support? The other part was a little bit earlier than that meeting, G.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference, where he criticized Europe for lack of free speech, implicitly encouraging right-wing European parties meeting with far-right leaders in Germany. That was also something that Europeans did not foresee. They did not expect that there would be a push for an ideological push from the Trump administration. And then lastly, at least in the case for Germany, there was a lot of fear that the United States would withdraw from NATO, which is one of the reasons why in the end Germany decided to reform its constitution and its debt brake, and within weeks to allow Germany to move to essentially unlimited defense spending, which will put Germany in 2029, that's the projection, at a level of defense spending that is roughly equivalent to what Russia spends in 2025. So that's quite a bit. So we had this disruptive shock from the European perspective, and I would argue it's also to some extent the fault of the Europeans for not having prepared enough. I do remember conversations where the idea was, where the feedback was, well, we should not talk about this scenario so it doesn't become a self-fulfilling prophecy. There were conversations about, this is something it's just 4 years. This is not a structural shift in US foreign policy. It's just 4 years that we can wait out. I think where we stand now is I think Europeans have learned to speak Trump 2, which is different than speaking Trump 1. And they, at least for now, and especially after the Hague summit in NATO, where they promised massive defense increases, they felt pretty comfortable in their relationship with the US president. But I do think they're realistic enough at the moment to brace for surprises. And those surprises can take place, for example, with a review of how many troops the United States has stationed in Europe, which is something that makes Europeans very nervous. What kind of signal does it send to Russia if a significant number of troops is going to be withdrawn from Europe? They're also nervous about the US-Russia relationship on a strategic level. New START, the only remaining arms control treaty between the United States and Russia, is set to run out in February. Will this lead to a normalization of US-Russia ties on the expense of Europeans and of Ukrainians? So there's a lot to be nervous about. And at the same time, Europeans are also buying time to increase their own defense spending and to defend themselves, because what they have not told their own publics for, I would say, at least 10 years since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, they have never really admitted to their own publics how existentially dependent they are on the United States, which is why in the European public you often get the sentiment, well, why don't we just defend ourselves? I mean, we do have Europe. Can we not, a couple of years invest a little bit? And then the realization is, well, it will take much longer because the dependence is so existential. So their strategy, I would summarize it at the moment, is keep Trump in, buy time, invest in your own defense, and that at almost all costs. So keeping Trump in is a top priority, and Europeans will sacrifice a lot, including trade and tariff deals that are to the disadvantage of Europeans for that goal to keep Trump in.
Tom, I was speaking to a European foreign minister at the beginning of the week, and they were saying that it wasn't actually Putin that really woke Europe up. It was Trump. his methods may be unconventional. He may buck the kind of traditional diplomatic niceties. But I think the example of Germany actually is particularly instructive. We had the Zeitenwende, sorry if I'm garbling that, after the full-scale invasion in 2022, but it was never really realized or put into action until this year. What do you make of the argument that Europe, which can be bogged down in deliberation, which can kind of tell itself these comforting kind of ideas, maybe did need some tough love?
I used to like to point out in the Biden administration that the increase in European defense spending in the Biden administration was at a faster pace and more than in the first Trump term. And, I think part of that's Russia, obviously. We like to say it was partly that, you could engage allies and actually get results. It didn't require, threatening to pull out. And I still think that. But I do also think that Europe has basically bent over backwards to accommodate Trump, right? And so they have, if you look at the trade side, and it's not just Europe, it's also Japan, South Korea, and others, but Trump has imposed the U.S. tariff rate on January 20th globally was an average of 2.3%. And as of like a week or two ago, which has been consistently for a couple of months, it's 17.9%. So he's basically increased the tariff rate from about 2.5 to about 18, roughly. And Europe has basically not retaliated, nor has any other country. They've essentially taken that because they worry that the U.S. has escalation dominance. So if they responded, the U.S. would raise them even further. And many countries, not quite so much in Europe, but Japan and South Korea have also agreed to these punitive investment deals where, the U.S. has sort of extracted very, very lopsided investment deals from them that Trump can sort of direct where a lot of that goes. A little bit of that's murky on the details still, but that's basically been his approach. And so effectively, in his that sort of narrow sense of it, it's the bullying has sort of worked, right? And, you could have Vance or whoever it is the next time saying, like, we really ran roughshod over our allies, and actually they took it, right? And actually they were bent over backwards to say, that they wanted to preserve the relationship because they are so reliant on the U.S. for security reasons that we can weaponize that and extract stuff economically. And I think that's worrying, and I think, I think we need to sort of reflect on that. Like, I think about the fact that, when we did the export controls with Japan and the Netherlands on China, like, we consulted massively to try to figure out a way to get the Dutch to agree to it and try to meet them halfway. And we did do some stuff unilaterally, but we tried to, have some delays to get them on board. Maybe we should have, I'm sort of half joking, but maybe we should have just imposed a 20% tariff and told them to do it. Why did we consult on that? And I think, Europe, I think, is in a difficult sort of spot now. I understand why they're doing what they're doing with Trump. I don't disagree on the policy, but I think it is sort of sending a message to the U.S. that that actually a more coercive approach can yield benefits, and that makes me uncomfortable. I don't like that, but I think that may be the political debate here on foreign policy, where you'll have sort of America firsters make that point, and then those who are more traditionally supportive of alliances will have to explain why it's actually important to work more constructively together. I would just say one thing on the defense spending, which obviously I think is good that they're increasing defense spending by as much as they are, but I think the intention is there, and I think people have sort of woken up, not just because of Trump, but also because of Russia and China to some degree. But I worry that it may be a little bit too much for them to pull off. Like, I think when you look at many of the major countries in Europe, especially the UK and France, I mean, they have real fiscal problems, and real domestic political problems. In both countries, there are populists waiting in the wings who had a very different perspective on a lot of this. I think Germany is a little bit of a special case, but Liana would be able to talk to that in more detail, than me. But I worry a little bit that by doing the tough love thing and by not sort of doing this together, they may sort of fall short. They may be unable to do it. And what I would like to see is a much greater degree of integration between the US and Europe on the defense industrial base, defense efforts, that we would do this sort of together. We do a lot more co-production, a lot more on the tech side, be a lot more integrated, and that we would have what Kirk Campbell and Russ Joshi call sort of an allied scale approach, which is we would basically scale up collectively, and that's not happening.
If I may add one sentence to that, and I fully agree with what Tom was saying, but I would also argue that for Europeans, the problem will be how to explain, if a Democrat comes back into the White House, how to explain that Democrat should go back to the old ways of the transatlantic relationship, because it has been, to be honest, such a humiliation to those who kind of in a nice way asked Europeans to increase defense spending, to engage more, and have not seen that return, right? I mean, I remember how for Germany at the beginning there was a lot of patience. Oh, we don't want Germans to drop the ball. They should take their time and so on. And so in the future it will be really difficult to argue with future presidents that there should be a return to sort of the traditional ways of the allied relationship. And at the same time, the dynamic within Europe is something that is, at least to me, also unclear for the moment. I mean, we have an increased defense spending, but will that lead into a real European capacity to defend themselves and lead together for the defense of Europe? If Germany increases its defense spending to the level that it does right now, or plans right now, it puts Germany into a position that many have been scared of historically. And I'm not saying that, Europe is returning to war without a US hegemon, but I do think the question of rivalry among European powers is not a question that is over now, or at least that it will be a huge challenge for Europeans to figure out how they can sort of lead the continent together with less United States in the future, if that remains the approach of the future, because no one will ever want to go back to demanding from Europeans, oh, please increase to 2%. And again, Europeans have taken a backseat in leadership during this war, during Russia's war against Ukraine. To me, for example, it was always not, I never understood why Secretary Austin had to travel bi-monthly to lead the Rammstein support group in Europe. I mean, bi-monthly, that's a lot of travel, which is now taken over by Germany and the UK, and it still works, right? So why was there not more leadership from the European side? They just felt too comfortable that under Biden, sort of history has returned to normal.
So I think I've got time for maybe one more question, and we'll go to your questions. So please get thinking on what you'd like to ask our excellent panelists today. I had a long list of questions, and I'm trying to think of what is the best one to wrap on. Maybe with, a look. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I think maybe with a look to kind of to the future and to what all this means for the rest of the world, given that the theme of the conference is world on balance. When we think about terms like the West or the liberal international order, that the two pillars of that have traditionally been the United States and Europe. The Trump administration has made it clear that it is not interested in playing a leading role on things like human rights, humanitarian aid, climate change, championing democracy, and we're seeing a prioritization on using the real kind of raw, hard power tools of statecraft, right? Gunboat diplomacy in the Caribbean, trade and tariffs. So my question is, and I think I'll go to Tom maybe for this one, can Europe go it alone? Can Europe uphold this idea of the liberal international order by itself? And if it can't, what does that mean for the rest of the world at a time when there's the pacing threat of China's rise and increasing cooperation amongst disruptive powers like North Korea, Iran, and China lining up to assist Russia in its war in Ukraine?
Yeah, so I think the short answer is no. I don't think it exists anymore, honestly. I mean, I think the whether liberal international order, rules-based order, I think it's been sort of destroyed by Putin and by Xi Jinping and by Donald Trump, and maybe by others too. But I think there's a combination of the major actors have, through territorial aggression in the Russian case, I think through China's economic policy, and the capacity problem and all of that since about 2015, and its preparations for war in Taiwan, and then by Trump's actions in the first term, and then him coming back, particularly important with the second. I think it shows there's no sort of return to normal. And I think, the rules-based order is basically a set of norms that were not perfectly adhered to, but did exercise some restraint on countries, that they chose to act in certain ways. And I think now the only real question for the major powers is what can you get away with? I mean, can you do something and get away with it at an acceptable cost, or will you pay too high a price? And we saw that on territory, like even with the United States, like with Trump musing about Greenland or about, the Panama Canal. It's not there's no sort of concern about what do the rules say, right? It's more like, does this make sense? Can I actually take it, and can I hold it? And will that be worth the sort of policy distraction for other, reasons and all of that? And so that's sort of the world we're in now. And, the global economy, which we haven't mentioned all that much, I mean, that has unraveled, where I think people see risk everywhere on critical minerals, on tech, on lots of other things. And the world is sort of trying to adjust. And so I think the question for Europe, I think Europe is the one actor in all of this that would like things to go back broadly to the way they were. Not everyone, but in Europe, but most of Europe, I think, would like to see a return to that older system. But it's no longer possible. And the question, I think, is here in the US is like, how do we approach that? Like, do we, I wrote a piece during the week saying that the choice really for the US is, does the US see itself as a captain of a team to try to shape the future, or does it see itself as sort of a predatory lone wolf just feeding off the land, trying to take whatever it can? And I think there is a bit of a divide between the parties, obviously, on that one. But I think for Europe, it's basically how do they cohere and get collective strength to be able to protect their interests in this new and dangerous world, and how do they do that in the short term to buy time to prepare for the more medium and long term too. And so, but I think the old days, the old sort of approach of international order, I think that's finished for the foreseeable future. There's no return to that, unfortunately.
Well, on that cheery note, we'll open it up to audience questions. Sir,
And because of the way that the audio is doing, even though it's a small room, we do want to make sure that it goes through the microphone so that the recorder picks it up. So
great.
Pass it
So
on to you.
this gentleman caught my eye first.
Nope.
If you could introduce yourself as well, please.
Yeah, sure. Paul Nugent, Southeast Connecticut. So as a European and an American citizen, I am profoundly embarrassed and annoyed by the shenanigans I see in the White House when Europeans visit. Okay, a question. So on the subject of, it seems to me the simple way to solve this is to do what you talked about, is to arm Europe, tell the Americans to go take a hike until you put somebody sensible back in government, if ever. But what's the sense in Europe, and is there any surveys on this, about the the European public. So in Britain, there's a bit of concern that they could go extremely to the right and follow Nigel Farage. There's other elements, although it seems to have calmed down a bit in Germany and France. But ultimately, Europeans, I know some of them are way too many are too young to see World War II in archive only, and some don't even believe it happened. But there must be a sense of great foreboding. So I'm puzzled that they don't want to increase their spending on arms, because the alternative is do nothing or depend on a hegemon that is, not what it used to be. Thanks.
Liana, would you like to take that one?
I'm happy to take that question. So there are opinion polls across Europe that ask the question, so what do you want Europe to do in the future? And there is a majority in many European countries that says we want Europe to defend us. So we want Europe to play a much bigger role on security and defense than in the past. The problem is that, and I say this so bluntly, I think European policymakers have for too long engaged in the illusion that they don't really have to take major steps towards that direction. Because, and it's always easy to judge in hindsight, but if we look back, it needed 2 invasions of Ukraine, and it needed 2 elections of Donald Trump over a period of 10 years for the Europeans to finally become serious about their defense spending. And personally, I think that's too long, right? And one can say there have been incremental increases in defense spending and so on, but that is just incredibly difficult to explain, right, to your public. Why are you still in such a disastrous position when it comes to your own security defense, although the writing was on the wall at least since 2014, if not 2016. And so, there are many technical military reasons why it's not so easy to tell the Americans to take a hike. Just as an example, when the war started in 2022, Europeans had real difficulties to just transport troops from the west of Europe to the east of Europe, right? Because it just didn't have the airlift capabilities that the United States has. I'm not even speaking about the nuclear umbrella that the United States provide, but just sort of on the conventional side, there's so many things that Europeans are not only lacking, but also that they are not integrating together. So you have wonderful European armies, but they are integrated under sort of a U.S. leadership and hegemony in the NATO planning, sort of operational planning. They have no alternative planning for any kind of warfare scenario that does not include the United States. And so that does take a lot of time. And again, I think the next question is, Europeans foresee themselves as this being kind of a return to the Cold War with Russia, right? Long-term deterrence, long-term defense. But the difference is the United States is not taking the same role as in the Cold War. And they have a Russia which is supercharged by China, and Europe's dependency and vulnerabilities towards China are even greater than they ever were towards Russia. So that's a completely different relationship, which is even more dangerous for Europeans to navigate these days. And I think that's why I see the challenge for Europeans is how to get from A to B. Right? It's a transition which is fundamentally dangerous for Europe's security. And ideally, Europeans want to, have a plan with the White House how they do this transition, so that a decrease in U.S. capabilities leads to an increase in European capabilities, and we don't have a delta in European security overall. Well, that is a pipe dream. This kind of thinking and plan doesn't work with Washington these days, and so you can end up in a worst case situation where European capabilities have not increased, U.S. capabilities are withdrawn, and then Europeans are in a real dilemma. Plus, of course, the threat of populists. But I'll stop here because it becomes too long.
Thank you. I think was there a question down the front here?
Yeah, I wonder, are there any repercussions on the European economy, German economy, on this increased defense spending? On your social services and all of that. And the other real big issue is, looking at history and all, are there really no repercussions to bullying your friends as well as your enemies? The U.S. and Americans will not have to pay a price for this?
I can take the first if you want to take the second. So Germany is really in an exceptional position because it had a debt brake in its constitution. So it had a balanced budget and its overall debt was pretty low. And now it has for the first time allowed to use debt financing for defense spending, but not for anything else. I mean, there is an infrastructure package there, but in principle, defense spending is the only area in the budget that can be financed via debt, which basically, the sky's the limit, which is remarkable in a European context. But for the other countries, Tom said that already, for France and the UK, it's much more difficult. And also Germany is at the same time in an economic crisis since 2019, basically. It's not only because of the pandemic and because of Russia's war against Ukraine, because China, which has been long seen as an opportunity and an export market, for German export world champion and so on, has sort of turned around, right? Now China is exporting higher-level goods, EVs, technology to Europe at state-subsidized prices that Europeans cannot compete with. So it's really the German industrial backbone that is currently challenged by the China shock. And this is something which does make me nervous, because on the foreign and security and defense spending side, it all looks great, at least what Germany is doing. But on the economic side, it looks much more gloomy in Europe. There are opportunities how to change that. Investment in defense, I think the jobs that will be lost in the automobile industry can go into the defense industry, for example. But it's a fundamental structural change in Germany's, and by extension in some parts of Europe's economy.
Yeah, I would just add, I think there is a price for sure, but I think it's not necessarily at the moment evident in the very short term, and so they can say it is sort of working, I guess, because they are linking the security to the economic piece. But I think I completely agree. And I would just point out, too, that he's not actually bullying America's rivals or enemies. He's got a very accommodationist approach to Russia. And actually, he seems to be really leaning into engagement with China as well. So it's all one-sided. It's more on the U.S. allies' point that he's really pushing.
Thank you. I'm going to go over to this side of the room, the gentleman here in the orange sweater. And can you introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, I'm Randy Evans. I'm from Jacksonville, Florida, retired railroad guy. What's going on in the relationship between President Trump and Putin? And I'll go to the dark side on this. The useful fool theory from the old KGB guys, that's the dark side. But when you look at the activities, it seems to be many of the things that we've done have played into what Putin really wants. And Alina, I was, terrified, but also instructed by what you said about how the European countries are reacting and coming to a realization about that. But anyway, if any of the three of you have any insight into that, I'd appreciate your comments.
I might put that one to Tom. What do you make of Trump's approach to Russia and to Putin?
Yeah, I think you can explain it without sort of any of the conspiracy stuff. How I would explain it is Trump's for decades, his main beef is with America's allies, right? Because he believes that free trade basically is a way of ripping off America, and he believes passionately in a more mercantilist approach where, countries are made to pay a big fee to basically sell stuff in the U.S. Now, that's not been the case for over a century, but that's his sort of belief. And so Russia has no trade with America, really, and has almost no economic engagement. So it doesn't tick that box of, we're getting ripped off. He also has a problem with allies because he doesn't really believe in security commitments and thinks, if we're providing security commitments to another country, they're taking advantage of us. And, of course, Russia's not an ally, so it doesn't have a security commitment. And then I think he likes the style of, the autocrat and I honestly think it's part of Russian culture and sort of the machismo sort of culture and sort of get things done loose and fast with the rules. all of that stuff sort of appeals, and then he sees some opportunity for, economic engagement that would benefit, him or his family or the U.S., maybe, to be generous about it. And he doesn't really care about Ukraine. So I think all of those are reasons enough. Now, the one thing I would say is Putin's a quirky guy, right? Like quirky is probably the wrong word. He's an odd guy. There was a story, I think in the FT, it might have been one of Amy's stories, I don't know, about Alaska, that he, he's obsessed by history. He's gotten more obsessed by history as time has gone on. He drones on and on and on about it. When he met Trump in Alaska, he spent basically, I think, 30 or 40 minutes talking about Yaroslav the Wise and Russian and Ukrainian history 600 years ago. And, Trump got really frustrated and was just like, I'm bored. I have no interest in this. And so, so there is it's not all sweetness and light. I think Trump is frustrated with Putin, but he doesn't want to take the next step, which is, okay, I'm frustrated with Putin. It's his fault. So now I'm going to dig in for a year or two and have a methodically patient policy to increase pressure. He doesn't want to do that. I think that's the main problem, I think.
I would just maybe add to that, kind of from my own reporting, I do think that the fear of escalation with Russia is genuine and also does inform some of the hesitation to impose greater costs on Russia. I think that is quite a strong voice in this administration. And when you look at some of the consistent through lines in Trump's view of the world, one of them is fear of nuclear war and nuclear weapons, and that's something that he's spoken about since the 1980s. And I think that Cold War mindset, I think, also plays a role.
One more question. So
okay, one more question. Sir, in the front row.
Hi, Michael Finkel from Naples, Council on World Affairs. Regarding what the Europeans would do without the United States, basically, how would they get around to deciding who would be the chief general? Would it be Liechtenstein? And also, the old NATO strategy was to stop the Russians from coming in East Germany to the West German border. Now you have a much, much larger territory, and especially with Finland, you've got 800 miles of border that was added on to be defended. And if you can't, how are you going to supply the Baltic states if you've got Kaliningrad in the middle of the Baltic as a problem?
Very good questions. I think we should be under no illusion that there could ever be a European army which is led by, just one European general. I just don't think this is how Europe works. And I know this is a tendency in the US, that Washington always wants to call, whom do I call when I call Europe and so on. That's never going to realize itself because European powers are just too similarly powerful to have one country lead them. But I do think there are creative ways how one can think about joint collective leadership also on the security and defense side. So you can think about regional commands, right? I mean, you have a very strong northeastern flank in Europe with Poland, the Baltic states, now Sweden, also Finland, Norway, right? So you can think about sort of one cluster there. You can think there are past examples of, Germany and Netherlands integrating brigades. So there are examples to build on which will most likely result in something that is, which I would call collective leadership in a core Europe, right? Where those countries who are willing and able move forward to provide collective leadership in Europe. On the defense side, it's interesting that Germany is working on placing a permanent brigade into Lithuania, so 5,000 troops in Lithuania. And the idea behind that is not only to be a tripwire, right, to draw Germany in, but 5,000 is like a real fighting force. So the idea is to deter the Russians from thinking that they can just overrun the Baltics. But then, of course, Poland plays a major role. So what has been the inner German border is, at least from a German perspective, now very much the Polish-Ukrainian border that is to be defended. And it has moved further east, but I think the idea is the same, right? To prevent that Russia can sort of advance in Ukraine further west, and at the same time try to project power into Poland, beyond Poland, to prevent such Russian escalations. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think it has to be put to the test. I think just because we had these two historical examples where Europe ended up in a mess when the United States decided not to engage, I'm not sure that you can really draw a rule from that any time the United States disengages from Europe, Europe will end up in war and chaos. I do think there has been a history in the European Union of getting used to each other, working with each other. I just think it has to get to a next level, and that will be not easy.
And with that, I'm afraid we are at time. I know better than to stand between an audience and their lunch. So thank you to my panelists, to Tom and Liana, for your fantastic insights. I think we covered a lot of ground on this fraught moment and sobering moment for the transatlantic relationship and what that means for not only for Ukraine and for Europe, but for the rest of the world. And thank you as well for your excellent questions as well at the end there. I think that really helped to punctuate our discussion. So now I'll hand you back over to our host.
Let's hear it for our wonderful panel. Liana Fix, Tom Wright, and if I heard correctly, I think Tom's ready to go on the circuit again with the World Affairs Council, so be a lookout for that. He'll be out there. Make sure you get his book. There's several books left. We don't want him to carry it back to his office, so let's make sure to get them all there. So, and of course, our wonderful moderator. Thank you so much, Amy McKinnon with the Financial Times. 12:30 p.m. That's the plenary luncheon down the hall. Starts at 12:30 on tariffs, supply chain, and trade. So, thank you all for being here. Enjoy the conference.